Hello, I'm Yanis Di-Fanteria, and this episode from Di-Fanteria Reads explores the Roman spectacle of Venatio, or hunting, and how Rome turned death into entertainment. Then, we'll look at how British comedy turned it back into absurdity. In 189 BC, the triumphant Roman general Marcus Fulvius Nobilior, on his return from defeating the Aetolian League in central Greece, introduced the gory spectacle of the Venatione. This horrific, violent, and ostentatious display of wealth and power was intended to entertain all citizens, from the patricians to the plebeians. So it was from this ignoble and ghastly commencement that in packed amphitheatres across the Roman Empire, gladiators would hunt and fight wild animals in the arena. To be precise, this was predominantly lions, cheetahs, and panthers, and as you would expect, the outcome was predictable, and very few animals survived these hunts, though they sometimes defeated the bestiarius, or the hunter of wild beasts. Thousands of wild animals would be slaughtered in one day, except wolves, of course, as they were honoured and had strong religious and spiritual significance for the Romans. With most of the animals lying dead or dying, the bestiarias would make their way from the battlefield, but the audience would not leave at this juncture, as the fulsome appreciation of the Venatio only came with the spectatorial finale of the day's gruesome events. The programme remained unfinished. It was to be followed by the execution of convicted citizens of the lowest status, the humiliores. This, for the delectation of the assembled and bloodthirsty gathering, the various methods employed in this final act of human depravity, if there was a programme of events, be advertised as burning alive at the stake, crucifixion, good, out of the door, line on your left, one cross each. And for your run-of-the-mill serious offender, the prisoner was left in the amphitheatre alone. Well, not quite, though. Any wild beasts that were still breathing were left as they were. This was known as the ad bestias, an ancient death sentence, and primarily what the spectators had come for. Dear me, how times change.
And there we have it. That passage is from Van Alen's Vertex, Book Two of ORSUS, and broadly speaking, it does what it wanted to do. But there is a slight problem. Once you take the fiction away and start pulling at the historical threads, the story becomes considerably more complicated. And indeed, considerably more interesting. So let's start with the man I blame for all this, Marcus Fulvius Nobilior. Nobilior was a Roman consul and general who campaigned against the Aetolian League in Greece in 189 BC, but the date in my original passage needs correcting. His victory was in 189, his triumph followed in 187, and the extraordinary public games associated with him took place in 186 BC. And for 10 days, Rome was entertained, and among the attractions was something quite extraordinary: lions and panthers. This is generally regarded as the first securely recorded Roman spectacle involving a hunt of exotic wild animals. But why? Why transport dangerous and beautiful animals enormous distances simply to kill them in front of an audience? And it's because the Venatio wasn't merely entertainment, it was more advertising. A lion appearing in Rome represented considerably more than a lion. Somebody had captured it, somebody had transported it, and somebody had paid for it. And somebody possessed sufficient influence, wealth, and power to place that animal in an arena for thousands of Roman citizens to watch it die. The message was difficult to miss. Look how far Rome can reach. And there's another message contained within the audience itself. The original passage talks about patricians and plebeians, but Roman society was considerably more complicated than that. Birth mattered, citizenship mattered, property mattered, political office mattered, freedom mattered. And your position could change. Plebeians could become enormously wealthy and politically powerful. A man without distinguished ancestors could rise through Roman politics. A slave might eventually become a freedman, and some freedmen accumulated considerable fortunes. But Rome never forgot status, and nowhere was that more obvious than inside the amphitheatre. Because Rome quite literally gave social hierarchy a seating plan. The privileged occupies the best positions. Others sat progressively further from the arena according to their status. You didn't merely know where Roman society thought you belonged. Someone had given you a seat there. And then there were the animals, because eventually this became an extraordinarily logistical enterprise. Animals came from across the Roman world and beyond it. North Africa, Egypt, Asia, and Northern Europe. Lions, leopards, bears, elephants, deer, bulls, ostriches, and creatures that many of the spectators had never seen before. They had to be captured alive, they had to be fed, they had to be transported, moved through ports and along roads, and then kept in holding facilities and vivaria, and then finally delivered to the arena. There was also hunters, traders, animal handlers, sailors, soldiers, provincial officials, and imperial administrators involved in supplying this extraordinary appetite for vulgar and, in our eyes, thoroughly disgusting spectacle. In other words, behind the blood and sand was something much less glamorous than the spectacle itself: administration, which, if you've encountered ORSUS before, should come as absolutely no surprise. The machinery matters. And then when we come to the men fighting them, I also need to qualify what I originally wrote. Beste, Arius and Venator are not perfectly interchangeable terms. Some men were trained professional animal fighters, others were slaves, prisoners, captives, or condemned criminals. So there was an enormous difference between somebody entering an arena because this was his profession and somebody being pushed through the same gate. After all, Rome had decided that the manner of his death should form part of the entertainment. And what about wolves? Years ago, I confidently wrote that wolves were exempt of their religious significance, or because of their religious significance to Rome. The wolf certainly possessed enormous symbolic importance. The she-wolf Lupa and Romulus and Remus, the foundation mythology of Rome itself. But in reality, there is little convincing evidence for a universal Roman rule saying that wolves were therefore protected from the arena. So that one has to come out too. And this is one of the pleasures of returning to something you've written years later. Occasionally, history rewards you. Occasionally, it quietly taps you on the shoulder and says, bollocks. There is one final correction: the humiliores. They existed, but the formal legal distinction between the privileged honestiores and the lower status humiliores belongs particularly to the later Roman Empire. So we've now travelled several centuries beyond Nobilior, and by then something deeply disturbing had happened. Even Roman citizenship did not necessarily mean equality before punishment. Status could determine not merely whether you were punished, but how you were going to die. Crucifixion, burning alive, exposure to wild animals, the damnatio ad bestias. The offence mattered, your legal status mattered, and the spectacle matters. Which leaves us with perhaps the most difficult question of all. Thousands of people came to watch this. They cheered, they bought food, they ate, they drank, socialized, they made a day of it. How could human beings possibly find any of this entertaining? Well, at this point, I'm going to abandon serious Roman history completely. We're now going to leave the amphitheatre. In fact, we're going to leave the Roman Empire. And we're travelling forward approximately 1700 years to Britain, to London, and to the BBC Light programme, and to the recording that was broadcast on the 28th of March 1957, because one of the most extraordinary comedic minds Britain ever produced looked at ancient Rome and apparently decided that what it really needed was Eccles. A brief indulgence. The short extract below comes from a Goon show written by Spike Milligan and Larry Stevens. It was recorded before a live audience at the CAMDEN Theatre in London on Sunday the 24th of March 1957, and first broadcast on the BBC Home Service 4 days later, on the evening of the 28th of March. It's entitled The Histories of Pliny the Elder, and this Goon show provided listeners with a rather unique take on Roman public entertainment, in very stark contrast to that created by Marcus Fulvius Nobilior. I've included this brief indulgence because it is as groundbreaking as it is hilarious. It's one of my childhood favourite episodes. It is best appreciated audibly, and I'm going to give it my best shot, but you might just find it on the internet. But give me a go. With comedic and timeless genius, it parodies the grotesque practices of the time, which gives the reader or the listener a delightfully bum-fuzzled look behind the scenes at the Venatio, and to mix the idiom with a more modern interpretation, which is equally as magnificent. Perhaps our spectators in Rome would be purchasing their finger foods from a purveyor such as this one. Lark's tongues, wren's livers, chaffinch brains, jagger's earlobes, wolf nipple chips, get 'em while they're hot. They're lovely. Dromedary pretzels, only half a dinar, Tuscany fried bats. Announced by Wallace Greenslade, we now take a trip into early Roman history as imagined by the late great Terence Alen Spike Milligan. This is the BBC Light programme. Who? History for schools. Question 1. How do you spell C-A-T? Cat! Well done! Question 2. Name 2 English queens called Elizabeth. Jim! Question 3. What is the Goon Show's first name? And give me an example of. That's a trick question, Wallace. So here is a trick answer entitled The Histories of Pliny the Elder. And so, in the year XL 111 BC, Julius Caesar set foot on the British shore and was greeted by the natives. Hello? Vide, vici. Eh? I came, I saw, I conquered. Oh, fine. Well, I'm just going in for a dip. Give the old kippers a steam. Brutus Moriartus, seize that Briton and prepare him for a life of slavery. Ave Section 2, Caesar. And like a mighty octopus, the legions of Rome spread across England. For 10 years, Caesar ruled with an iron hand, then with a wooden foot, and finally with a piece of string. How much of this could Britain take? Caesar is a nobleman. Yeah. Oh, Caesar, I come to sing melodies divine to you. Sing on, proud minstrel. Thank you. Oh, Caesar is a nobleman, a king of great renown, a gentleman be every inch of him, from his feet to his head. Moriartus, this man is a bit of a crawler. Why does he follow such a profession? For money, Caesar. He tells me he wants to die rich, and so he shall. Give him this sack of gold, and then strangle him. Away, Caesar. I see that 10 years in Britain have not changed your imperial Roman outlook, Caesar. True, Moriartus, always a Roman eye. Will you take wine? No, thanks. I think I'll have a half a barrel and a packet of crisps. We now skip to the Colosseum in Rome. I say, what a wonderful agent that fellow is. My first night in Rome and I've got a booking already. Wow, now let's have a look at the programme. Oh, it's a good programme. Yes. What is top of the bill? Oh, it's got a lovely opening act. Let me see now. Captain East Finchley Boy Scout will fight 4 starving lions. Oh, I do not like this lying game. Let me out here! You coward, Bluebottle. Face it like a man. Yes, well, look at the encore there. Caractacus Seagoon will be strangled by gorilla. Let me out! Let me out! You can't do this to me. I'm a British subject. I should write to the Times about this. Help! Let me out! Help! Oh, shut up, you. It was perfectly quiet till you came along. It's all right for you. You're a sailor, and sailors don't care. Oh! Now, don't panic, everybody. I've got a plan. We'll overpower the guards. Yes! Right, I'll take my boots off. I don't think we wish to know that. That was the last of the present series of The Goon Show, a BBC recorded programme featuring Peter Sellers, Harry Secombe and Spike Milligan, with the Ray Ellington Quartet, Max Geldray and the orchestra conducted by Wally Stott. Script by Spike Milligan and Larry Stevens, and Sir Wallace Greenslade. Bobby J has been mixing on the panel, and the special effects were supplied by Ian Cook and Ron Belshea. The production was by Pat Dixon. I did warn you, it was an indulgence. What on earth's just happened? What the hell was the Goon Show got to do with Marcus Fulvius Nobilior? Actually, quite a lot. Nobilior understood something in 186 BC that politicians, emperors, impresarios, propagandists, and comedians have understood ever since. Human beings love spectacle, and Rome used spectacle to demonstrate power. The exotic animals were important precisely because they were exotic. A lion brought hundreds of miles to Rome was evidence of that, and it was evidence that Rome could reach into another land, capture something extraordinary, and transport it across an empire, and then place it beneath the gaze of an ordinary Roman citizen. The amphitheatre performed much the same trick with people. It demonstrated who possessed power, who possessed status, who sat where, who decided, and ultimately whose death could be turned into somebody else's entertainment. That is spectacle in the service of authority. And then nearly 2,000 years later, something rather wonderful happens. The spectacle survives, but authority changes sides. Spike Milligan had been a soldier, Harry Secombe had been a soldier, Peter Sellers served in the Royal Air Force, and Michael Benteen, who'd been with the Goons right in the early stages, served in the RAF as well. They belonged to a generation which had experienced enormous institutions, deprivations, and toil at first hand. The armed forces, government, bureaucracy, rank, orders, the war, regulations, forms, official announcements, and the occasionally magnificent absurdity produced when human beings attempt to make all of those things work. And the Goon Show discovered something extremely powerful. If authority insists upon being taken seriously, sometimes the most devastating response is to simply make it look ridiculous. Generals could become idiots, officials could become lunatics, historical figures could behave like imbeciles. Wars could be started by misunderstandings, entire countries could disappear with a sound effect. And in that respect, radio was the perfect medium for it. Marcus Fulvius Nobilior required an arena, thousands of spectators, wild animals, and an enormous logistical operation. Spike Milligan required a microphone. And all of the rest of it happened inside your head. And among the generation absorbing this glorious lunacy were people who would take the idea somewhere else again. Monty Python. And suddenly ancient Rome became irresistible. Crucifixion became an administrative procedure. Revolutionaries became committee room bores. Roman soldiers became grammarians. Imperial authority collided with bureaucracy, and one of the most horrifying methods of execution in the ancient world could be reduced to the magnificently mundane and excruciating polite. Crucifixion? Good. Out of the door, line on your left, one cross each. Which finally brings us back to Nobilior. And an afterthought. Marcus Fulvius Nobilior probably never imagined that anyone would be still talking about his games more than 2,000 years later. But perhaps we've been looking at the wrong thing. The animals changed, the amphitheatres disappeared, the empire disappeared, but the spectacle didn't. Human beings still gather together to watch. We still celebrate. We still choose heroes and villains. We still respond to theatre, ceremony, and extraordinary displays. And people in authority still understand the extraordinary power of spectacle. Rome was simply exceptionally good at it. It turned military conquest into theatre. It turned social hierarchy into architecture. And eventually, it turned punishment and death into entertainment. But humour can perform the opposite transformation. It can take something enormous and make it very small, take something frightening and make it utterly absurd. Take somebody demanding reverence and make everyone notice that he's wearing a particularly silly hat. And that is what Milligan and the Goons understood, and it is something that Monty Python inherited. They weren't merely making jokes about history, they were applying absurdity to authority. And perhaps there is a reason why so many of the people who created that extraordinary post-war generation of British comedy had themselves worn uniforms. Anyone who has spent sufficient time inside a large institution eventually discovers something rather important. The institution itself can be magnificent. Its purpose can be deadly serious. The people within it can be extraordinarily brave. And yet, parts of it can still be completely bloody ridiculous. And the two things are not mutually exclusive. Perhaps that's why military humour can be so savage and yet so affectionate. Perhaps it's why the goons could ridicule the army without ridiculing soldiers, and why Python could make Roman crucifixion funny without asking us to believe crucifixion itself was funny. The target isn't necessarily the victim. Very often, the target is the machine. And the Goon Show discovered something extremely powerful. If authority insists upon being taken seriously, sometimes the most devastating response is simply to make it look ridiculous. And people were listening. John Cleese was listening. Michael Palin was listening. Graham Chapman was listening. John Lennon was listening. And across the Atlantic, the future members of the Firesign Theatre were also listening. And what they inherited wasn't simply a collection of funny voices and ridiculous sound effects. To some extent, it was permission. Permission to abandon logic, permission to break the structure, permission to interrupt the announcer, permission to acknowledge the audience, and permission, above all, to take institutions which demanded to be treated seriously and refused to do so. Monty Python inherited it. Alternative comedy inherited it. Douglas Adams took that absurdity into his science fiction. And generations of comedians subsequently discovered that once Milligan had kicked the door down, there wasn't much point putting it back on its hinges. Lots of other people were listening too. As I said, the future Pythons were listening. John Lennon was listening. And what followed wasn't simply imitation. Again, it was the permission to abandon logic, to break the structure, to attack pomposity with nonsense. From Python to alternative comedy, Douglas Adams to Reeves and Mortimer, Chris Morris and far beyond, once Milligan had kicked that down, again, there wasn't much point putting the door back in. So we began with Marcus Fulvius Nobilior, a victorious Roman general demonstrating wealth, conquest, and authority by putting beautiful exotic animals into an arena to be killed. We travelled through the machinery required to make that spectacle possible. And somehow we ended up in 1957 with East Finchley Boy Scouts preparing to fight 4 starving lions, which is quite a journey. But perhaps the connection isn't as ridiculous as it first appears. Rome turned death into entertainment, and nearly 2,000 years later, British comedy turned that spectacle back into absurdity. And personally, I know which audience I'd rather have been sitting in, although I think I would pass on the chaffinch brains. Splitter! I'm Di-Fanteria, and some of this was ORSUS, dedicated to dreamers everywhere.